Hello there, my name is Aanvi Verma. I'm a sophomore at Base Scottsdale, and this is going to be my thesis defense regarding understanding impacts of physical activity and sedentary behavior. So what this is going to be is a comprehensive review of physical activity guidelines and current literature. All right. So introduction. So basically, cardiovascular disease is when there are problems in the heart and the blood vessels. So these can be structural or involving diseased vessels and blood clots. So the official United States government recommends that Americans engage in at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity every week. And it's extremely surprising considering that less than 30% of adults and less than 35% of high school students actually meet this recommendation. They also suggest executing around 2 days of muscle strengthening activity or resistance training. So onto the slide. So we can see that levels of physical activity can be divided into sedentary behavior. So for example, this could be people sitting or laying down all the time or engaging in light activity. So that would be taking short walks around the house or household chores, etc. Moving on, there is moderate activity, which is basically just brisk walking, and vigorous activity can be seen by extreme exercise. So if you're running or sprinting, maybe doing push-ups. So as you increase levels of activity from sedentary to vigorous, you're going to be gaining like incremental health benefits. So this is my own original chart. I used it I made this by utilizing BioRender and a few image generators. All right, so onto the next slide. Physical activity basically encapsulates a lot of health benefits. So the most important was definitely preventing cardiovascular death, because 1 in every 3 deaths due to cardiovascular diseases are preventable with exercise, meaning that we lose 30% of patients just because we lack physical activity. So in the United States alone, 1 person dies of cardiovascular diseases every 33 seconds. And the objective of this paper is to show that sedentary behavior is spreading in the United States, and physical inactivity rates are leading to early mortality. So how can we prevent cardiovascular death? Well, physical activity is actually the real key to reducing death. And this analytical graph demonstrates that the population who actually met physical activity recommended targets had 41% reduced hazards of mortality compared to those who didn't. So to elaborate a bit more on this graph, we can see on the x-axis that we're seeing the time frame. So we're going from 1998 to 2014. And the y-axis is kind of just showing the hazard, the hazard ratio. So everything below the line of 1 resulted in reduced risk of mortality, meaning that they're meeting physical activity guidelines. Everything above 1 was that they're having more risk of mortality. They're not exercising enough. Their diet isn't healthy enough. So they're more at risk for cardiovascular disease. All right. So this slide, I feel, is one of the most important in my PowerPoint because it's the real encapsulation of tremendous benefits on different disease processes. So it's seen to reduce and go around the circle. So one thing we're seen to reduce is we're reducing dementia by almost 30%, all-cause death by 30%, breast cancer risk by 20%, depression by 50%, colon cancer by 30%, hip fracture by 68%, cardiovascular disease by 35%, and type 2 diabetes by 40%. So what this kind of shows is that physical activity does have a way of moving into every single disease that we can think of. So by including it in cardiovascular disease, one thing that we're doing is we're helping prevent other diseases that could lead to early mortality as well. So unfortunately, one thing that I did notice throughout all my research is that sedentary behavior has increased astronomically in the past decades. As more people are spending more time behind their screens, whether that means online jobs or playing video games, they're not being as active as they used to. And this is leading to early mortality and early risk of cardiovascular diseases. So methodology. All right. So initially I did use PubMed searches and I found several different papers after restricting my search to English language, and I ensured that the time frame was definitely between 1990 and August 2024. So I then included studies if they reported physical activity, sedentary behavior, and outcomes such as cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular death, or provided insightful mechanisms regarding physical activity benefits on health. So basically, most of these papers were outcomes and mechanisms. All right, literature review. So multiple studies have shown that multiple studies show that beneficial health effects of physical activity. So when you increase your behavior from sedentary to physical, you're going to get a never-ending world of new health benefits. So in the chart that I created, you may be able to see the word MET. So METs are basically metabolic equivalents that you use to encapsulate how much oxygen we use. So in the lowest category on sedentary behavior, one of the things that we see is that you're using less than 3 METs. So that means that you're not using as much oxygen, you're not using your heart as much. This is part of the reason why we lead to cardiovascular diseases. And we can see at the highest level at vigorous intensity activities, we're using more than 6 METs. Now this is 2 times as many as you would be doing if you were utilizing sedentary behavior. All right, so onto the literature review. Myers et al. In their study included over 6,000 men and reported that 1 MET increase in exercise capacity conferred over 12% improvement in survival. So once again, METs are metabolic equivalents. It's a measure of energy expenditure, and 1 MET is the amount of energy consumed while sitting at rest. All right. So Clark et al. In their study included over 21,000 people and showed that cardiovascular prevention program with exercise compared to those without exercise at 12 months followed up. So basically what this ended up reducing was all-cause mortality by 15% and recurrent heart attacks by 17%. All right, so Taylor et al. In their study, they evaluated 9,000 patients with 48 trials. And they found that cardiac rehabilitation, they proved that cardiac rehabilitation was associated with 20% reduction in all-cause mortality, 26% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, and that there were greater reductions in total cholesterol, triglyceride levels, systolic blood pressure, and lower rates of self-reported smoking. And just a heads up, rehabilitation is basically a monitored exercise program that they were utilizing. All right, so Stephan Beatty et al. What they did was that they studied over 400 survivors of heart attacks and followed them over a 7-year period. And I feel like this was the most important piece of literature that I reviewed throughout my paper because they were taking literal heart attack victims. So what they saw was that they were more active compared to sedentary patients. They had around a 79% reduced risk of death. So that means that even though they were sedentary most of their life, once they started exercising again and once they started taking care of themselves again, they did reduce their chance of death. And patients who were sedentary and increased their activity had an 89% reduced risk of death. All right, so back to this slide. Okay, so one of the things that is given in this review paper is that the author explains the mechanisms on how physical activity helps cardiovascular outcomes. So this includes blood pressure, blood glucose, cerebral blood flow, and vascular function. All right, so on to results. This is an image I took from the World Health Organization. And what this heat map is trying to show is the association between physical activity and risks of cardiovascular diseases and death. So the red represents high risks of death, and green represents low risks of death, and the orange and yellow are kind of the transition from high to low risk. So my interpretation of the graph is that those who are inactive and fall in the red zone of the graph can improve their survival rates by increasing their activity levels. All right, and on to my conclusion. So this comprehensive review of literature kind of emphasizes that physical activity is linked with a lot of health benefits. So these include reducing all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, cardiovascular risk factors, dementia, bone health, among a lot of other health benefits. So to achieve a lasting change, we have to increase awareness. And as a society, we need to remove the barriers that are preventing people from being active. So reducing sedentary behavior, we should be replacing it with increased physical activity. And although it's not listed on the slide, a limitation of my research did include that it's only applicable to patient populations studied in the trials and discussed in my paper. So we can't really generalize this. However, the patients that were used in all the experiments that I did read through, we can generalize it there. All right, thank you. Hi, so just finally, I'd like to thank Gifted Gabber for all their help.
No, go on. It's fine.
Okay, yeah. So finally, I just really want to thank Gifted Gabber for all their help and support. They kind of taught me how to complete my research paper in a timely fashion. Professor Virgil was an excellent mentor, providing his inputs with the writing format of the paper, and Dr. Prahlad provided an exceptional guidance with picking relevant topics and finding materials for research. So I feel like because it was so systematic and well planned, and it was really coordinated nicely, all my questions were really answered in a timely fashion. And just a huge thank you to Coach Joe for making this platform where we as high school students can kind of come and follow our passions of conducting research. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And a question from Dr. Prahlad.
Great job, Aanvi. The presentation. So one question for you is like, did any of the papers look at any of the factors like dietary factor? Some people cannot do exercise, right? So is there any other way to reduce this cardiovascular risk?
So one of the papers that I did read, I believe it was from the National Institute of Health, it kind of started talking about how walking is the most accessible form of exercise, and it did dive deeper into dietary factors. So by doing, moderate physical activity, so that can be walking, lunching, these are accessible to everybody. So I feel like that was one of the most accessible forms of physical activity. And in terms of dietary references, it did talk about a bit about how, cholesterol and things in that category kind of did lead to cardiovascular diseases. So I guess one of the biggest things that I saw based off of cholesterol was that it can be prevented while walking and running. And, because walking is so accessible to everybody, that's the biggest one I would say. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Great job. Congratulations.
Great job.